Upanishads Introduction. The Upanishads are philosophical and theological, mystical treatises forming the third division of the Veda. The preceding portions being the mantras or hymns, which are largely prayers, and the brahmanas or sacrificial rituals, the utterance successively of poet, priest, and philosopher. There are two great departments of the Veda. The first is called Karma Kanda, the department of works, which embraces both mantras and brahmanas, and is followed by the vast majority of the persons whose action of religion is laying up of merit by means of ceremonial prayers and sacrificial rites. The second is called Jnana Kanda, the department of knowledge. The department of knowledge is the theosophic portion of the Vedic revelation, and this is embraced by the Upanishads and is intended for the select few who are capable of attaining the true doctrine. The most important of the Upanishads belong to what are called Aranyakas or forest books, which form an appendix to the Brahmanas and treating as they do of the release of the soul from meta psychosis by means of a recognition of the oneness of its real nature with the great impersonal self, and are so profound that they were required to be read in the solitude of forests by persons who, having performed all the duties of a student and a householder, retired from the world and their days passed in the contemplation of the deity. The Upanishads are as far removed from the ancient poetry of the Veda as the Talmud is from the Old Testament and Sufism is from the Quran. They represent the results of the first plunge of the human mind into the depths of metaphysical speculation and investigate such abstruse problems as the origin of the universe, the nature of the deity, the nature of the human soul, and the relation of spirit and matter. The etymology of the word is doubtful. It probably signifies sitting down near somebody in order to listen or meditate and worship Upanishad, so that it would express the idea of a session or assembly of pupils sitting down at a respectful distance, secret doctrine, a digest of the principles and mysteries contained in the Vedas. And some Indian philosophers derive the word from the root sad in the sense of destruction, meaning thereby that the secret doctrine fully apprehended would destroy all passion and ignorance and all knowledge derived from the senses merely, all knowledge save that of the self. Now about the number and divisions of the Upanishads. With the disappearance of many of the recessions of the Vedas, many Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads also disappeared. The fact that the sacred books were not committed to writing in ancient times is partly responsible for this loss. Furthermore, among the works surviving, it is difficult to ascertain the exact number that should be regarded as authentic Upanishads. A religious system is considered valid in India only when it is supported by Shruti, the Vedas. Hence, the founders of religious sects have sometimes written books and called them Upanishads in order to give their views scriptural authority. The Allah Upanishad, for instance, was composed in the 16th century at the time of the Muslim Emperor Akbar. 108 Upanishads are enumerated in the Muktikopanishad, which is a work belonging to the tradition of the Yajurveda. Among these, the Aitareya Upanishad and Kaushitaki Upanishad belong to the Rig Veda, the Chandogya and Kena to the Samaveda, the Taittiriya, Mahanarayana, Katha, Shvetashvatara and Maitrayani to the Krishna Yajurveda, the Isha and Brihadaranyaka to the Shukla Yajurveda, and the Mundaka, Prashna and Mandukya to the Atharva Veda. It may be stated also that these Upanishads belong to differing recensions of their respective Vedas. Thus, for instance, the Mundaka Upanishad belongs to the Shaunaka recension of the Atharva Veda, while the Prashna Upanishad belongs to the Pippalada recension. The Brahma Sutras, which is the most authoritative work on the Vedanta philosophy, has been based upon the Aitareya, Taittiriya, Chandogya, Brihadaranyaka, Kaushitaki, Katha, Shvetashvatara, Mundaka, Prashna, and possibly also the Jabala Upanishad. Shankaracharya wrote his celebrated commentaries on the Isha, Kena, Katha, Prashna, Mundaka, Mandukya, Aitareya, Taittiriya, Chandogya, Brihadaranyaka, and possibly also the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. These latter are regarded as the major works. These are probably as old as the 6th century BC or anterior to the rise of Buddhism and the fundamental Upanishads of the Vedanta philosophy. The teachings of the Upanishads, Brahma Sutras, and the Bhagavad Gita form the basis of the Vedanta philosophy. But the Vedanta has different schools of interpretation, represented by the three great Acharyas, Shankara, Ramanuja, and Madhava. That Shankara, being the oldest and the most orthodox and in closest harmony with the ancient pantheistic thoughts of India. The Upanishads undoubtedly admit of different interpretations. Their authors belong to different sections of society, some of the most important being Kshatriyas or Rajput kings. And these generations of Vedic theologians had their own favorite sacred texts which they studied and speculated upon. These speculations coming in course of time to be looked upon as sacred too. There is unquestionably a certain uniformity of leading conceptions running throughout the Upanishads, though with considerable divergence in detail. They were, however, never meant to form a philosophical system coherent in all its parts and free from contradictions. Their authors belong to different periods of time and do not claim any divine inspiration that would preserve a continuous revelation of truth. The views of one sage do not seem to agree in several important points with another as to the nature of the Supreme Being, whether he possesses qualities saguna or is destitute of qualities nirguna, though the latter represents, as we shall see, the prevailing thought. They differ also as to the reality or unreality of the external world, and as to the nature of that soul, whether it is of minute size and an agent and therefore finite, or whether it is identical with the supreme and therefore infinite. All these invests these ancient treatises with not a little difficulty to those who study them, though their interest and value are not thereby diminished. The Upanishads undoubtedly represent the highest product of the Indian mind, and one of the most imposing and subtle of the systems of ontology yet known in the history of philosophy, and the Vedanta, styled by Shankaracharya, the string upon which the gems of the Upanishads are strung, is regarded as the finest flower and the ripest fruit of Indian spirituality. They contain the highest authority on which the various systems of Indian philosophy rest, and are practically the only portion of Vedic literature which is extensively studied by orthodox educated Hindus in the present day. The Vedanta philosophy has also its appreciators in Europe, not to speak of its similarity in some respects to Berkeley's idealism, though essentially different. Professor Max Muller has represented in it in an attractive light, and some German philosophers such as Schopenhauer and his ardent disciple Professor Deussen of Kiel confess to much enthusiasm for this particular wisdom of the East. These two speaks these two speak of the study of the Upanishads as elevating and consoling. It is urged by modern Hindu Vedantists that the school of German thought, first expressed by Kant, completed by Schopenhauer, and further elaborated by Deussen, brings the Western world nearer and nearer to the Advaita or monistic position, and the Vedanta is claimed to be the key to all religions, the lamp by which all can be studied. Professor Deussen says of this system that it is equal in rank to Plato and Kant, and is one of the most valuable products of the genius of mankind in its search for the eternal truth. This is precisely what one can feel in studying the Upanishads. Though a perusal of the literature is great intellectual treat, there is a strange medley of the sublime and the commonplace, of profundities and trivialities, of philosophy and superstition. One can find there the nature worship of the Vedas, especially of the sun, and mention made of 33 gods. One can find sexual relations even in the Supreme, that the self divided himself into two and so produced husband and wife, and from these were created everything that exists in pairs, down to the ants. One can find details of Vedic sacrifices, of oblations, of cards and honey, and many puerile rites and superstitious ceremonies. One can find human greatness associated with children and cattle and fame and long life. One can find astrology and strange astronomy, such as the soul leaving the body and passing through the air, coming first to the sun and then at a greater distance ascending to the moon, and the Hindu belief about eclipses, the moon escaping from the mouth of Rahu. One can found one can find interesting evidence of the knowledge and practice of certain arts and sciences, such as melting of iron, pottery, wheel making, and the chemistry of metals. Also, that a divine origin is claimed for caste, and such bewildering morality as this, that a man who knows a certain thing, even if he commits what seems much evils, consumes it all and becomes pure and clean. One can find a full blown and elaborated doctrine of transmigration, and that those whose conduct has been evil are born again as dog or hog, worm, insect, fish, bird, lion, boar, and serpent, rice and corn, herbs and trees, sesamum and beans. One can find also much importance attached to protracted bodily stillness and fixity of lock, to certain modes of breathing, and to suppression of breath, to the mental repetition of strange sets of formulae, and to meditations on the unfathomable mysteries contained in certain monosyllables, such as the famous Om, the symbol of the Absolute under its threefold personalization. One can find great subtleties of thought expressed in such pregnant brevity that in very sentence we seem to read a page. A labyrinth of mystic language, tedious repetitions, and puerile conceits. The use of fanciful metaphors and unconnected images of defective analogies in place of proof, such as arguing from a rope being mistaken for a serpent, to the unreality of the visible universe, or from the man with diseased eye who sees two moons where there in reality only one, to show that it is only ignorance, avidya, that takes the world as real, or from the fact that all earthen pots are in truth only earth, that the whole world is nothing but Brahman. One can find a want of system and of common sense, a tendency to speculate rather than investigate, and therefore controversies always beginning afresh, the solving of insoluble enigmas, the attaining unattainable frames of mind. But all these one passes over, unaccounted for and unexplained, and desire to notice rather the best features of the Upanishads, those that lift the human heart from the earthly to a higher level, the elevated thoughts and noble conceptions, the deep spirituality, the pathetic guesses at truth and relation to the highest questions that the human mind can propose to itself. For in the groping after something felt to be needed, in the yearning of hearts dissatisfied and empty, lies the value of the Upanishads. In their seeking and searching after the infinite, these songs before sunrise, as they have been styled, must always have a profound interest for every devout mind. They do not claim, as does the Bible, to have a divine message for the world, neither do they contain, as do the Vedas, any fervid and beautiful prayers to God. They are rather psychological excursions about God. The Bible shows God in quest of man rather than man in quest of God, and when thoughtfully studied and experienced, will be found to meet the questions raised by this ancient philosophy and to supply its only true solution. What now is the fundamental idea and the highest object of the Upanishads, as interpreted by the first great commentator Shankaracharya and in part also by Ramanujacharya? It is this, that behind all the phenomena and mythology of nature, behind the Vedic deities, there is a supreme soul of the universe, the highest self, the Paramatman, the Absolute, offering certain parallels to the idealism of Plato or to the infinite being of Spinoza or to Hegel's rationality of the universe, though more psychological or spiritual than either of them. And further, that behind the veil of the body and the senses, behind one reason and all psychological manifestation, beyond the ego with all its accidents and limitations, there is another Atman or subjective self. This self can only be discovered by a severe moral and intellectual discipline, such as is practiced by the sannyasin or mendicant, ascetic or yogi, a person having his senses and passions under complete control, and those who wish to know not themselves but their self have to penetrate behind the mind and the personality before they can find the self of selves. The old man, the looker on. The highest knowledge possible to man begins to dawn when the individual self, being a mere transitory reflection of the eternal self, and the highest aim of all thought and study is through this knowledge to return to the highest self and regain identity with it. The jar is broken, and the ether that was in it is one with the one and undivided ether, from which the jar once seemed to sever it. Here to know is to be, to know the Atman is to be the Atman, and the reward of this highest knowledge after death is freedom from new births or immortality. Such was the dream of ancient India, and the loftiest peak of its philosophical thought. The first attempt at the philosophy of the absolute instinct with the spirit of speculative daring, and it undoubtedly shows us the very best that the human mind is capable of reaching. The highest self, the Atman, than which perhaps no happier philosophical expression has been found for the universal principle, was the goal of the endeavor. It was also the starting point of all phenomenal existence, the root of the world, the Sat, the root of the world, the Sat or Satya, the only true and real existence. Whatever else exists, the universe and gods and men has but an emanative existence or an illusory existence under the influence of Maya. The whole creation, visible and invisible, being due to the one Sat or self, is upheld by it and will ultimately return to it, as one of the Upanishads profoundly and beautifully says. There is one eternal thinker thinking non eternal thoughts. He, though one fulfills the desires of many, the wise who perceive him within their self, to them belongs eternal life, eternal peace. The highest wisdom of Greece, it has been observed, was to know ourselves. The highest wisdom of India is to know ourself. Thus we see the transcendental character of Indian thought, the yearning after the beyond, the unseen, the infinite, the necessity to transcend the limits of all mere empirical knowledge, to penetrate the mere shell and grasp the innermost kernel, the last of the several enclosing envelopes or sheaths beyond which we cannot pierce. To such a mind, the finite is meaningless without the infinite. This material earth has no abiding. Life is a dream, and death a birth and an awakening. India is the land of the infinite. Its skies are so deep and blue, its mountains are lofty and inaccessible, its forests are so dense and boundless, its rivers are so broad and long that it is natural for the Indian to conceive the infinite. And herein lies the peculiar strength of the Vedantist position, which all opponents of a materialistic or naturalistic philosophy must admire. When attacked, Hinduism has always kept open a line of retreat upon transcendental fortification and has not attempted to make compromise with scientific research. In harmony with what is best in the present philosophical thought of the West, the Vedantists affirms that the empirical school, as expounded in recent years by Spencer, Mill, Huxley, and others, leads logically to agnosticism. since its sphere of knowledge is limited to the world of sense perception. It is through going in its grasp of the physical half of the phenomenal world, but cannot comprehend the psychical, the region of man's religious convictions and beliefs. It is here where philosophy steps in to emancipate the scientific reason. It contrasts phenomenal with nominal realities. It deals primarily with consciousness or the mental world, maintaining that it is only of the ego that a direct knowledge is possible, and the element of permanency in the material world of perception and in the mental world of self consciousness, of which Western philosophy has not obtained the clearest vision, is set up as an ultimate fact of philosophic analysis by the Vedantists, who always inquires into the ultimate basis of phenomena and declares that the eternal cannot be known through the transient. The Supreme Being is believed by the non dualistic Vedantists to be associated with a certain power called Maya or Avidya, to which the appearance of the universe is due, and it is urged by some that it is called Maya or nescience, ignorance or illusion, because the world and its belongings stand in the way of our reaching to a knowledge of the ultimate truth, the eternal substratum of the world, the underlying principle of existence. The first step to the knowledge of the Supreme is the recognition of this permanent element. And if we would get at the truths which lie beyond and behind this world of action and the play of the senses, we must, according to the Vedanta, cultivate self restraint and tranquility, suppress our actions and senses, or at any rate renounce the desire for the fruit of one's actions, since it is this fruit or karma that chains one to this world by repeated births and deaths. The various systems of yoga philosophy current among Hindus, as these self restraining exercises are termed, have for their foundation the national belief in the necessity for human souls to seek liberation from the bondage of the flesh by realizing, as the Advaitin or non dualist does, that the eternal principle of all being, the power that creates, supports, and again withdraws into itself all worlds, is identical with the Atman, the self or soul in us. These systems of yoga teach each its own method of attaining the desired end, but all enjoying the performance of works in a spirit that renounces all attachment to results. The latent capacity of men of transcending the finite and his affinity to what is universal and infinite is the key to the evolution of religion, and ancient India supplies us with its earliest form. At first sight, the personification of the objects and forces of nature, the sun, the dawn, the firmament, the winds and storms, such as we find in the Vedic hymns, seems to present a polytheistic nature worship. A closer study, however, shows us that the various divinities have not that distinct individuality which marks the mythologies of Greece and Rome, but that beyond and beneath them all there is an invisible reality, a unity in which they blend, and for which they are only varied expressions, as a passage of the Rig Veda states that which exists is one. Sages call it variously. Now, what was it that led the mind first of all to defy certain natural objects? And now, what was it that led the mind first of all to deify certain natural objects and then to find beneath them all an enduring substance, passing from the worship of the elements personified to the worship of the power that rules over the elements? It was the sense of the vanity and unreality and fleeting character of all finite things, the inadequacy of their satisfactions, the insecurity of their possessions, the lack of any fixed stay. This feeling undoubtedly represents the earliest dawn of the religious consciousness, the elementary form of religious faith, such as we find in ancient India. It is a later stage of thought that argues from the existence of the world to the notion of a first cause, all wise and omnipotent creator. To the Indian, the all embracing sky, the majestic sun, the silent stars, the everlasting hills, the noble rivers become to the mind types of permanence and power in the midst of a feeble and fleeting life. And these are fourth with deified. There we have the earliest and rudest form of religious worship. Gradually, however, as the mind became more reflective and philosophical, these separate nature divinities fade away and nature is regarded as a whole. Till in the Upanishads, the religious consciousness attempts to pass beyond nature, beyond everything, beyond where words cannot go, nor mind, and to grasp an invisible essence which is neither the heavens nor the earth, but something infinitely greater and more abiding than all, pure being, the innermost being both of nature and man. This philosophical synthesis, the pantheistic idea of God implicit in the Vedas, explicit in the Upanishads, thus early rooted itself in Hindu thought, and out of it has grown all the moral and social life of the people. Pantheism, in some form or another, has pervaded the intellectual history of mankind and fascinated some of the greatest thinkers of the world. For there is pantheism and pantheism. European pantheism has commonly made God to be coextensive with all material things. It has identified the world with God. All things being parts of the divine nature, that is, the finite is the infinite. Indian mystic pantheism, however, is very different and is far more spiritual. It affirms not the deification of the finite world but its nothingness. The formula that expresses it is not the world is God, but the world is nothing and God is all in all, the one only infinite reality. It was thus primarily a true consciousness, the consciousness of the world's nothingness, that gave rise to the conception of a substance beneath the shadows, that beyond the finite is the infinite, summed up in the Indian dictum. There is but one being on second, ekam evam aditiyam. It is the answer that the human mind at an early stage gives to the problem of the one in many, an attempt to give unity to its ideas by the aid of the logical category of substance. For just as behind the various qualities and changes of a flower there is something we regard as constant and permanent, So, beneath all the surface appearances of things, there is one and only one reality that never changes. One being Brahman, and he who would know him or it must turn away from all sense perception and contemplate pure existence. At such a stage, when the mind was groping and guessing after truth, metaphors rather than formal reasoning governed thought, and the deepest reflections of philosophy were embodied in sensuous images. The Supreme Being is represented as saying, I am the light in the sun, the brilliancy in flame, the fragrance in the earth, the goodness of the good, the beginning, middle, and end of all. But what was meant was that God is the only being that really is. The writers of the Upanishads, the writers of the Upanishads seem to have clearly seen the distinction between dogmatic and rational theism. The theism that is based on mere traditional or instinctive belief, and the higher faith that comes out of insight and deep reflection on the nature of the world and of the soul. Having seen this distinction, they could not but further see that the passage from the one of the other was not an easy one. Everyone that professed to be a believer and worshipper of God and felt a curiosity to know God could not be admitted into the privileges of a theological student. Notwithstanding his belief and inquisitiveness, he might not possess the moral and spiritual attainments necessary for a successful student. His mind might be too restless and too much taken up with things external to be able to fix itself upon super sensuous realities, and if by mere dint of intellectual concentration he succeeded in understanding the nature of the deity, his heart, unless purified and warmed by devotional exercises, would fail to establish itself in God, and would not thus truly find Him. Our theologians therefore insisted upon their pupils going through a long course of moral and spiritual exercise before they were admitted as regular students of the science of God. In the Prashnopanishad, we find the Rishi Pippalada sending away 6 inquirers after God, inquirers who are described as worshippers of God, sending away even such men for another year of disciplinary exercises before undertaking their regular instruction. In the Chandogya Upanishad, Satyakama Javala is turned out to tend his teacher's cattle, which not only tests his theological order and teaches him to be dutiful and obedient under the most trying circumstances, but further brings him into direct contact with nature and gives him special opportunities for cultivating habits of solitary reflection so essential to the knowledge of things divine, so that after his long and rigorous course of apprentice, apprenticeship he is enabled to know God with only a little help from his master. In the Kathopanishad, Mrityu consents to instruct Nachiketa in the mysteries of the soul only when, after offering him all the attractions of his divine palace, including all that men value most, he saw that the young man was insensible to them and would not be satisfied by anything else than the knowledge he sought. The same Upanishad says, he who has not given up bad habits, whose mind is not tranquil, and use the spiritual concentration cannot find him, that is God, even by knowledge. Showing that knowledge, which is so essential to the finding of God, is not in itself sufficient to lead to Him. We need not multiply instances. The following quotations indicates briefly how very difficult the rishis considered the passage from the religion of mere belief to that of philosophical or spiritual insight to be arise, awake, seek competent instructors, and try to know God. The wise say that way is as difficult to be passed as the sharp edge of a razor. Once admitted into the privileged circle of theistic inquirers, the pupil must have been made to go through prescribed courses of meditation and reasoning. What the lines of thought were which he followed in his attempt to reach rational or philosophical theism, it is scarcely possible for us to discover with any amount of certainty. The instruction imparted must have been largely, if not exclusively, oral. The art of writing, even if introduced at all, must have been in its infancy, so that no records properly so called remain of the teachings of those who founded the philosophy of the Upanishads. The Upanishads, however, are not systematic treatises on philosophy. They contain, like the Bible and other ancient scriptures, exhortations on ethical and spiritual life. Anecdotes, stories, poetry, psychology, and devout utterances that are as often poetical as philosophical. But notwithstanding their unsystematic character, they contain the elements of system, a profound and magnificent system of philosophy, being the product of various authors and even of different ages. They are not free from contradictions even on important matters, though the philosophical reader, accustomed to tentative expressions of apparently conflicting but really complementary aspects of the same truth in philosophical literature, will find fewer contradictions in them than the ordinary reader. Though, however, a strictly self consistent system can no more be gathered from the Upanishads than from anybody of sacred books. A general current of thought towards certain philosophical doctrines may clearly be traced in them. This general current of thought in the writers of the Upanishads is all that we mean by the philosophy of the Upanishads. However, though, as we have already observed, we have no proper record of the lines of thought which our old theistic thinkers followed in reaching their conclusions. The conclusions themselves, and often the language in which they are clothed, indicate with sufficient clearness the method adopted by them. There are, besides, here and there passages containing more or less luminous philosophical analysis which throw much light on the logical processes through which the minds of the rishis moved. Gathering these scattered fragments of light, we shall give a rough idea of the theistic philosophy of the Upanishads. On the subject of the relation of mind and matter, all indications lead us to conclude that the writers of the Upanishads were idealists. To them, as much as to Berkeley and Hegel and their followers, the world is through and through a mental construction. Whether manifested or unmanifested, it rests in mind. Objects to them, as to the European idealists, are essentially related to knowledge and can therefore exist only in knowledge. The Aitareya enumerates the various classes of objects, animate and inanimate, including even the highest gods, and says all is produced by reason and rests in reason. The world is produced by reason and rests in reason, and reason is Brahman. The Katha says, in him rest all worlds and none are apart from him. The Prashna says, as my dear birds rest on trees, so all rests in the Supreme Self. These and innumerable other passages of similar important can be explained only in the light of idealism. That can the resting of all things in the Supreme Mind mean but the correlation of subject and object. The rishis must have seen that objects with all other qualities appear to mind, to knowledge, and that they can be believed in and thought of only in relation to mind. As the Mundaka says, in whom the luminous one all things rest and shine, and elsewhere he is the shining one, all things shine after, all shine through his light. Such utterances may seem to some to indicate a being whose existence is inferred from the indications of law and order in the world. A being whose relation to nature cannot be explained by the familiar relation of subject and object, and who, if he is directly cognizable at all, is so only in supreme moments of mystical insight. But the authors of the Upanishads, unlike the natural theologians of Europe, made little use of the design argument. The reason in which they saw the world shine is not one of which they had any need to go in search of by the aid of ingeniously constructed arguments. They found it in themselves. It is identical with what everyone calls his own reason, his own self. It is that which is the subjects appear and exist for us. Let us hear how the Kenopanishad distinguishes subject and object and identifies God with the former. But by identifying Brahman with the subject or self in each person, do not the Upanishads make him limited and plural. They would indeed do so if by the self they meant anything that is in its every nature individual, particular. But by self, the Upanishads do not mean any such thing. But by self, the Upanishads do not meant any such thing. They mean by it something that is in its very nature universal, that is common to all thinking individuals, the common basis of all subjects, animate and inanimate. At each step of analysis, the rishis names a category which comprehends the lower categories till he comes to the highest category, the Supreme Self, which transcends not only the sensorium and the intellect, where time and space end, but also that center of spiritual activity to which, as a substance, intellect itself is referred as a mode or attribute. By the Supreme Person or Self, therefore, the Upanishads mean something that transcends time, space, and quantity, which belongs not only to me, a particular center of spiritual activity, but to all such centers. As the same Upanishad says, what is here is there, what is there is here. He who sees who sees plurality in this goes from death to death. This is made much more clear in the dialogue between Narada and Sanat Kumara in the Chandogya Upanishad. Sanat Kumara enumerates a number of categories, coming to a higher one at each step as Narada feels dissatisfied with each last. And at last he comes to prana. Narada seems satisfied, as he cannot think of a higher category than life, with the departure of which every activity in us ceases. But Sanat Kumara leads him to the highest category where alone final satisfaction can be obtained, and that is the infinite Bhuma. But Narada, like all minds in which the highest enlightenment has not dawned, asks, where does the infinite abide, O Lord? Just as we ask, where is the self? Or say, the self is here, thus making space a higher category than self. Sanat Kumara at first says, the infinite abides in its own glory, but as if in anticipation of Narada's question, where is that glory? Sanat Kumara withdraws even this seeming limitation of infinite and says, it does not abide in its glory. This infinite, which comprehends all space and so cannot be anywhere in particular, is then identified with the self, and the infinitude of the self described in the words verify, and the infinitude of the self described in the words, verily I extend from below, I extend from above, I extend from I extend from behind, I extend from before, I extend from the south, I extend from the north. Of a truth, I am all this. It is then said that all the categories or objects enumerated above are products of the self. No demonstration in the ordinary sense of the term is offered of this apparently starting position that the self in us, that starting position that the self in us, that which makes us knowing, thinking beings, is infinite and one in all. This may be partly due to the rishis not being perfect masters of the art of exposition, but it seems also in part due to the fact that the truth appeared to them too plain to require any formal demonstration. To us, it seems that when one has brought to a focus all the scattered rays of light the rishis have thrown on the problem, it strikes one as a real demonstration, if demonstration is the word for the revelation of a truth, which forms the background of all knowledge, all thinking, all demonstration. In thinking of objects, we necessarily think of a subject. In knowing and thinking of the limitations of objects, even of mutually exclusive thinking objects or minds, we necessarily do so from the standpoint of subject which transcends all limitations. We do so only by identifying ourselves with a universal which, since it is the condition of knowing and thinking limits, cannot itself be limited. In other words, it is not any individual, any particular center of spiritual activity as distinguished from other centers that knows and thinks limits as such by the infinite itself that does so. And in as much as the infinite thinks my thoughts for me, I am one with it. There are also passages which seem to teach the utter annihilation of all that is finite and objective. Much depends upon how these passages are interpreted. We think, however, that spiritual experience conforms the interpretation which construes such annihilation into the real subsumption of the finite into the infinite, the full consciousness on the part of the finite that in itself it is nothing. The infinite is all in all.